This is Judge Joe Brown, and we're listening to We All Be News, news-free Dixie for the 21st century.
All right, Brother Judge, are you there?
Yes.
We All Be is proud to have on the one and only Brother Judge, Brother John Judge, world-class political assassin, extraordinary historian, alternate historian, and expert about political assassinations and political movements in this country. It's an honor to have this brother on. And we'd like to get down to, I guess, first we'll talk about the Martin Luther King assassination. And we'll try to get to the truth of that. In your estimation, what really happened April 4th, 1968?
Well, I think just in some ways the same thing that happened November 22nd, 1963, and later in June, on the 5th and 6th of June, Robert Kennedy in Los Angeles, and even earlier in 1965, on February the 21st in New York at the Ottoman Theater when Malcolm X was killed. These were political assassinations for political purpose, and some of them reached further than others. But to me, the bottom line is they represented an attempt to kill hope among people for leadership towards social change. And while I think the Kennedys were not saints, they were being pushed by the social movements of their time toward détente, toward an end to the Vietnam War and to the arms race and nuclear testing and a more peaceful world. And therefore a smaller military budget, military-industrial complex that Eisenhower, the president, had warned about when he left office in '59, that was growing and would take over the country if not checked. And I think that the Kennedy brothers stood up to the CIA, the Bay of Pigs, and to the Pentagon establishment that wanted to invade Cuba and also have U.S. air cover to do so and to overthrow Castro. He stood up to, he fired several CIA directors after that. He stood up to them on the Cuban Missile Crisis, refusing to go to the nuclear war that General LeMay and the others wanted. And similarly, by the time Bobby went through his transformation and came out in '68, he was in a position to reopen the case of his brother's death. He was leaning toward the civil rights leaders and the people that were working for social change in the country. He wanted to end the Vietnam War as his brother had tried to do. And I think that it's clear from the documents that they feared in the FBI the rise of a black messiah. In their COINTELPRO program, the CIA was focused on King under Operation Chaos for what they call black militant or black radical groups that they thought threatened the national security of the United States in their terms, which basically meant white privilege. And I think that similarly when King began to work with Malcolm in the 60s on the poverty issues and the economic issues that went beyond mere integration, they saw both of them together as even more of a threat, and had hoped to keep them split and keep them apart. The FBI had penetrated and driven wedges in the Nation of Islam for many years, and that's part of the situation they set up to bring about the death of Malcolm X, but it was done intentionally, and people were used in all these cases as pawns. Different groups were encouraged to take part in them on the mechanical level so they could take blame at the time and take credit right ahead, right when it happened, and then take blame when the time came for asking questions about it. They could point to these underlings in the same way that a schoolyard bully will go out and try and organize people to beat you up while they stand back. And I think that there were standing mercenary armies made up of anti-Castro Cubans for the CIA's use. But the DIA and the military intelligence is an even more important piece of all of these assassinations than most people have any understanding. Many talk of FBI and CIA. The military intelligence, Army intelligence, spied on Dr. King's grandfather and have been tracking that family for decades. Colonel Vandeman, who made the original lists of Reds and radicals in the country that led to the mass deportation and the Palmer raids in the 1920s, and gave his lists over to J. Edgar Hoover to start the FBI. And eventually Hoover said they had profiles and open files on and dossiers, as he called them, on 50 million Americans, and that they, or 150 million Americans, and that there were 250 in total, and that they had to close the gap. The Church Committee found that the Army intelligence had files on 8 million people that were active, and they said they destroyed them, and they actually said that 8 different times. Those files would show up at a new military intelligence base, they'd destroy them again, and then they'd reoccur. And even Hoover's files disappeared into the hands of the Pentagon as soon as he was dead. L. Patrick Gray from the Office of Naval Intelligence, the oldest and largest intelligence operation in the country, took over the FBI. His first act was to fire all 9 heads of the Criminal Records Division, giving him direct physical access to Hoover's bribery files and the other dirt that he had on everyone. And by the end of the week, when interviewed, he said no such files were at the FBI. Well, that's because they had moved them, gotten them out, and taken them over to the Pentagon or whatever part of military intelligence they needed to put them under. But military intelligence played a role in all of these assassinations and targeted the people long before FBI or CIA got involved or were used, primarily in the cover-ups more than the activities. The teams that killed Kennedy included CIA schleppers and mafia goons and anti-Castro Cubans and the Gusanos, the worms as they're called, in the progressive Cuban community, standing mercenary armies in the United States that eventually grew into Alpha 66 and Omega 7, and the kill squads here in the United States. The initial connection of intelligence to the mob is not the CIA in the 60s and 70s. It's that's talked about in the Church Committee hearings. It's in the 40s between the Office of Naval Intelligence using the mob and the docks, supposedly to fight Nazi infiltration, but actually eventually used to counter communism internationally through ports and the rise of communism after the war. And so the ONI, Naval Intelligence ties to the mob, date back to Lucky Luciano and Meyer Lansky, and really the beginnings of the international heroin traffic that were set up through those connections. And the DIA, which most people don't even know the initials of the Defense Intelligence Agency, they can get 600 books on the CIA, but the DIA controls 85% of the intelligence budget in this country. It began the largest internal and totally secret police force in the United States. It still exists, the Defense Industrial Securities Command, to guard the Manhattan Project. I recommend very much that people read Gary Will's new book, Bomb Power, which explains how the changes made in order to keep the secret for building the atomic bomb and use it, the presidential powers that came out of it, are all and the secrecy are all the things that plague us today in terms of how we lost democracy in this country. And they were all justified because the bomb was supposed to have won the war, even though the reality is, of course, that it did not, and was not the turning factor that they tried to make it into. But even though other excesses during that time, like the internment of the Japanese, were eventually considered to be unconstitutional and wrong, the Tennessee Valley Authority, the Manhattan Project, all the secrecy that came out of that was justified and continued into the current period. So 85% of the budget for many years, 100 times the employees of the CIA and the FBI combined, make up the DIA and its National Reconnaissance Organization, satellite spying, defense mapping or geophysical agency, the branch intelligences, Army, Navy, Air Force, and Marine intelligence, and the special forces fall under them. The NSA, the electronic ears that listen for every communication around the world. There are, there's 13 official intelligence agencies, 15 I think now with the recent Homeland Security and the Director of National Intelligence, and the vast majority of those are military intelligence. The Director of National Intelligence is a military figure all the time coming out of the DIA. So that's the real spies in this country, which you know nothing about. You can get hundreds of books on the CIA. Find me 2 or 3 on the DIA or any of its agencies or its operations. They have plans for martial law in this country. They have plans for what they call continuity of government. If you ever go to Code Red, 150 authorities change and put the military in control of everything from roads to mail to media. These were the forces that were moving on the civil rights and the peace movements and the movements for social change that grew up in the 60s and gave people some sense of hope for the future. So the primary thing that happened in Memphis, I think, is that they killed people's hope for the future and for social change, and then that June in Los Angeles as well. But in terms of the actual event, the gunman was not James Earl Ray. The gunman was not in the window of the bathroom. I've been up there. You couldn't get the shot off without poking a hole in the wall with your left elbow. There was a tree in the way that they came and removed the next day in the middle of this impoverished neighborhood of single-room only alcoholics mostly. Why they'd be beautifying it along an alleyway. But it made it better for the photo shots for the press to make it seem like you could see King out that window. You couldn't have. The shot that hit King, according to the one guy looking at him up on the balcony, parallel with him, Joseph Lowy, who turned out himself to be CIA, making a documentary about King's movement, and an international filmmaker, but funded by CIA to be there. But he at least had the honesty when asked to say that the bullet lifted King off his feet. His feet left the balcony, and he was spun to his right. Now, a bullet coming downward from his right would have done just the opposite, thrown him to the balcony and spun him to his left. And the bullet hits him in the chin and then goes inward. We don't know the exact path. The House Select Committee said it didn't matter since Ray shot him anyway. But Dr. Francesco, the coroner, or medical examiner, I think probably a better term for him, said that he didn't do an autopsy and trace the bullet surgically because out of respect for the family. How about some respect for the truth or for justice? And he later was the one that covered up Elvis Presley's death, and he was actually invited in June to come to Los Angeles and do the medical work on Robert Kennedy's body. Thankfully, we got Dr. Noguchi, the L.A. coroner, stepped in and did an honest autopsy on Robert Kennedy, which has told us for all these years that he was shot at such close range that the gunman could not have been Sirhan, and was in fact not a second gunman there. The gunman in Ray's case was across from him on in a backyard, basically, of the Kniep amusement store. A package was dropped 5 minutes before the shot rang out. In front of Kniep's store, a bundle, including the rifle that they would say was the murder weapon. They didn't test it that day to see if it had been fired. They later falsely tried to link it to the rifle at the FBI labs, link it to the bullets that killed King, but when tests were done later by Judge Joe Brown in Ray's appeal, who was a ballistic expert himself, it's clear that that was not the murder weapon. It was a weapon they could link to Ray, though, which is what they wanted to do. The woman who rented the room in the rooming house does not describe Ray. She describes a separate individual. A police artist did a workup from her description that appeared in the New York Times as a drawing of the assassin. It looks not at all like James Earl Ray. It looks very strangely almost identical to one of the three tramps who were arrested in Dealey Plaza, though, and is most likely the character Raoul, the mysterious character that Ray said was moving him around and paying him and using him as a mule, and set him up to take the charge. Ray came back from changing a tire, saw police all over the area, and took off. And then eventually was captured in England on his way to Rhodesia, trying to get out of the country, and his multiple criminal, small sort of incompetent burglaries that had kept him in and out of prison for many years. But he had escaped once more, this time again, I think, with help, and was financed to get that far before he was arrested and brought back, and then set up in a mini trial to take a plea. His lawyer coming to him at the last minute saying he wouldn't defend him and he'd get the chair if he didn't take a plea. And then the lawyer even gave $500 to his brother, which is illegal, for the appeal afterwards. Ray appealed immediately to Judge Battle. Judge Battle died of a heart attack with Ray's appeal open on his desk. And under the Tennessee law, he was the only judge that could reach an appeal in that first year, so legally. So Ray had to wait and try it in other courts, and eventually got up into Sixth Circuit and a couple of appeals, and then Dr. William Pepper was able to represent Ray on new technology, new laws in Tennessee that said that new technology could be used in an old case, and he reopened it. But as soon as Judge Brown said that wasn't the rifle, the state Supreme Court in Tennessee removed him from the case. And before they got another judge, Ray died in the prison of a liver cancer that could have been cured. Pepper had arranged a liver transplant, but the prison authorities wouldn't let him out. Then Pepper served as the attorney for the King family and brought the civil suit that's up online at the King Center that has the testimony, and got the jury to rule that not only was Ray innocent, but that a conspiracy that went up to the higher levels of government had been involved in the death of Dr. King. And Dr. Pepper, who has two books, Acts of State and Orders to Kill, is coming out with a third, because since he wrote those two, more people have come forward supporting his thesis, and he has new information that he's going to get out. He's also serving now as an attorney for Sirhan and trying to get a similar appeal for Sirhan out on the West Coast. But we do what we can to reopen these cases. We found an audio tape. Dr. Robert Joling, the former head of the American Academy of Forensic Sciences, Philip von Prague, an audio expert, worked for several years verifying the tape. It was an audio tape hidden in the California Historical Archives for nearly 25 years, but they were able to prove that this tape was taken on the night of the Kennedy assassination in the pantry at the time of the shooting, and it clearly shows from the audio spikes that are, can be studied by audio experts with their gunfire, that there are a total of 13 shots fired, 8 from one gun, which is Sirhan's, 5 from another, which is the second gun in the pantry. In all these cases, patsies are set up to take the blame, who are not the actual assassins. Many of them are programmed, mentally programmed as assassins under MKUltra to forget what they've done. Sirhan to this day can't get past the deep hypnotic blocks. The one psychiatrist that did try to get him there and started to have some success was removed from the case and quit over it because he'd never been told not to talk to somebody in the California prison system. He'd worked for them for 20 years, Dr. Simpson Callis, and but they don't want Sirhan to remember what happened around or set him up. So we get these phony gunmen and phony snipers' nests. The Sixth Floor Museum has memorialized a sniper's nest up in the book depository to say Oswald did it. The National Civil Rights Museum has memorialized the bathroom in the rooming house to say that Ray was the assassin, and that's where he shot from. At the same time, reverse grading the dirt behind the old Kniep's amusement, which they also restored. They reverse graded the hill, broke the retaining wall that held the hill up from Mulberry Avenue, and have steps going down it. So today, if you wanted to stand where the real assassin of Dr. King stood, you'd have to get a cherry picker because the ground no longer exists beneath your feet.
I want to talk about that. I think it's for, I mean, like, you know what, you talk about 1984, and George Orwell said that those who control the past controls the future, and evidently that is the greater conspiracy theory of them all about controlling how we interpret the past. And I think you're such an encyclopedic knowledge. I mean, you've been doing this for a long time. And I want to back up I want to make a couple of points, like Dr. Noguchi out in L.A., the medical examiner for Bobby Kennedy, also examined Marilyn Monroe, right, and proved that she did not commit suicide.
Yes, Dr. Noguchi found fresh needle marks in the back of Marilyn Monroe's arm and knew something had been injected into her forcibly that night, and that she did not commit suicide from taking the pills. She had been bugged. The room had been bugged. She had ties with military intelligence herself, going back to the early part of her life and with the Howard Hughes circle and her job at Lockheed. But she was... she was primed to some extent for her Hollywood position. She knew many people in the mob rat pack there, Frank Sinatra and the brother-in-law, Peter Lawrence, and of the Kennedys, but she had called Sidney Skalski, the gossip columnist in New York at the time, that night, telling him that that they had bugged her bedroom so they could get tapes if she slept with the Kennedys, and blackmail them, and she didn't want to go along with it, and she was going to call the Kennedys and warn them, and that's the night that she's murdered. And then people come in, they clean the area, they delay giving her body to the coroner, but Noguchi, in that and a number of other cases, I think he has a whole book out about the cases he handled, but a number of important cases, Noguchi did good autopsy and forensic work that belied the official stories. But of course, he's the coroner, and what else is there is the LAPD and the corrupt government that involved with them. I mean, the people that browbeat the witness of the man with the pencil mustache, the Latin guy that ran down the steps with the woman in the polka dot dress after the shooting of RFK, clapping his hands and saying, "We got him, we got Bobby, we got Bobby." And she was browbeat to change her testimony for hours by Manuel Pena, supposedly an LAPD officer, but just back from a CIA assignment in Central America with his partner. And so the police departments are not only corrupt, but they're totally penetrated with intelligence agents that carry out their role in the specific assassinations or things that need covering up.
I want to talk about because you on point. I want people to understand what you're talking about, and they are going to understand because they got to listen. They're going to have to listen to what you're saying. They're going to have to replay this because I think it's so important what you're saying. That our government is complicit in undermining and terrorizing our citizens. Like, you talk about military intelligence from the police department. I always want to go back to the Dr. King assassination. I think it's very important. We talk about how the shot didn't come from the building, but it came from the bushes, whatever, by Mulberry Street. Because we talk about James Orange, who was a part of the SCLC, one of Dr. King's aides. We talked about his driver, Solomon Jones. They both stated that they saw gun smoke come out of them bushes. It got cut down the next day by the Memphis city government. They cut the bushes down. They both said they saw smoke out of the bushes. Right.
And they saw the gunman get up, rise up. Right. They call him Cornbread Carter, and also Erskine. The attorney was down there talking up to King on the balcony, and they both said that the shot rang out past their right ear. Well, if they're facing King, it would have gone past their left ear if they heard it at all at that height, but this bullet was coming almost level with King, so it would have made probably a zip sound just above their head. and they said they heard it out of the right side. So that's also consistent with where the shot really came from. And then they saw a guy get up and would take a rifle into the back of the little eatery there. They had the Knief's Amusement, and next to it they had Jim's.
Lord Jowers' place.
Yeah, it's Lloyd Jowers' place. I think they called it Jim's, but it was a little breakfast and lunch place there. And then Jowers, who testified in the King trial, hid the rifle for several days. But that was only, even that gunman had a backup, because if he had failed to do what he was supposed to do, there were members of a Special Forces unit, Army Intelligence, assigned up on top of a water tower on the railroad building nearby that had a clear shot and had King in their sights waiting for a sniper shot order. And then were pulled back when the other gunman hit him, who could be tied instead to the mob, I think, and could be a false lead if he was ever pursued. But they did have backup, just like they had, I believe, a second shooter if Robert Kennedy had gone the other way. Penn Jones, one of the early researchers, found photos of gunmen on a tower, or not tower, a stadium down Stemmons Freeway on the way that Kennedy would have had to go. So if they hadn't hit him sufficiently, and he's running from it on Stemmons, they had a second backup gun system. So I don't think they leave these things to chance. When they're going to do them, they get as many possible shooters as they can. And there were also two men, according to Weems, the fire chief, who came from, they said, Army Intelligence, and asked to go up on the roof, and were taken up there with photo equipment. And there were veterans who saw photos of the actual gunman from that position, looking down on him, and saw photos of the events of that day in Army Intelligence files. When we brought a Freedom of Information Act for the Army Intelligence records on Dr. King in the last 2 months of his life, first they said they didn't know who he was. We went back and forced them to look, and then they said they couldn't find anything, and we took it into court with a pro bono attorney here. And so there's actually a suit, if you go look it up, called the Coalition on Political Assassinations v. the Pentagon, asking for these files. But the same week that we filed that, I got attacked in the L.A. Times on a front page article, on MSNBC, on Ariana Huffington's show by Gerald Posner, and also slammed by one of the other big commentators who was on talk shows at that time, but he's not somebody that knows even who I am. I mean, I'm not a name that people know from national TV or anything. Joe McLaughlin Hour, and he said that Mel Gibson in the movie Conspiracy Theory played a jacked up, programmed MK Ultra assassin with a John Judge personality.
Oh wow! I mean, that's a compliment.
So, not too many people have been portrayed by Mel Gibson in a movie, but they said I was.
I'll take that. I'll take that any day. I think, but you raise a great point, because Dr. King was not going to leave Memphis alive, regardless.
That's right.
He was not going to leave because he talked about foreign policy and the economic policy of this country. I mean, that famous speech at Riverside Church, April 4th, 1967. Then April 4th, 1968, he was dead.
Now that sealed his fate.
To the message.
Some ways the same as Kennedy's speech on June 10th, which we commemorate here every year at American University, where he called for an end to the Cold War, an end to detente, an end to the arms race, and stop the nuclear testing, and really went the other direction from where the Joint Chiefs wanted to go. That was a last nail in his coffin, and I think it was great that Tavis Smiley had the insight to interview these people about that speech, because most of the media over these many years have frozen Dr. King on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial in 1963 because he's safe back there. And they don't want people to know about the king that by 68 was saying that it's not just racism, but it's also militarism and poverty and economic privilege that have to be dealt with, and they have to be dealt with together to have any change in this society. And they mentioned on that show that he had been in touch with his father before he was killed because he planned to preach at the family church, the Ebenezer Baptist Church in Memphis, the next night, and that his topic was about whether or not America was going to hell.
Oh, you mean Atlanta? But I got it on that Sunday night.
In Memphis, yes, the Ebenezer Church in Atlanta, where his mother was killed by Marcus Wayne Chenault in the church, or at least we believe so. I mean, there could have been second guns in there because no ballistics were ever done, but Chenault, the gunman, comes out grinning, asks if he's hit anyone, and flourishing 2 guns. And this was right after the first public statement by Coretta Scott King that she believed a conspiracy was involved in her husband's death and wanted the case to be reopened. And Coretta and Alberta, Mrs. King, and the brother A.D. King were the 3 witnesses at the morgue to King's body and would have been able to see the wounds, at least externally, in his throat, and probably could have been material witnesses to the fact that he was not shot from the other direction, that this was a wound coming up basically under his chin. And A.D. King died very strangely in the family backyard pool, fully dressed in a suit and tie, lying face down in the water, and the family always believed that he was murdered. I do as well. Even Judge Battle was not the last judge to die in the case. Judge Miller in Cincinnati in the 6th Circuit really took up Ray's case and tried to help the attorneys find a place to hang their hat to get a remand of the case, and argued with the other justices and got the first remand, and then it was brought back to the 6th Circuit a second time, and he heard the second appeal. And Judge Miller was a strong judge. He had been the judge that decided for stair-step integration in the South back in the 60s, and he was also the judge that put Jimmy Hoffa in jail for jury tampering.
Wow.
And it was clear to me, I went down to both the appeals and listened to them. It was clear to me that he wanted to do something about getting Ray, acquitted and, get the case overturned. Then I asked, when the decision came out in the Cincinnati Press, I picked it up, and it said that the justices of a 3-judge panel had voted unanimously against Ray. I was shocked, and I asked the clerk to send me the court slip on the case and the decision. And he mailed it up to me. I was in Dayton at the time. And here on this slip, it has the 3 justices, a unanimous decision by these 3 justices. It named the other 2, and it says Miller. But on Miller, they have a footnote. And Miller, in the meantime, before the case came out, went out to lunch with all the justices at a racket club, a rather ritzy club in Cincinnati. And he came back to a special meeting of the judges in the chambers, and all of them were in there. And then eventually they called out and asked for an ambulance, which came far too late to save him, and he supposedly died of a heart attack in the chambers, but they weren't making any rush to call anybody to help save him. So he was basically DOA, dead on arrival, at the hospital, but I don't think I think there was a long, from the testimony, the statements of them, there was a long gap. So here's this footnote, little asterisk, and the footnote says, the other 2 justices have voted posthumously in Judge Miller's behalf.
I ain't gonna speak for him. He dead.
Dead man up and raised his hand.
Right. That's crazy. I mean, and why are we not questioning this type of lunacy? I mean, it's like court procedures gone wild. This is not right. I mean, this is. You know what, brother John Judge? I just, people talking about conspiracies. I think, it's weird. You look at Caesar. We know who killed Caesar, Julius Caesar. It was the senators, his own senators that killed him. It was very direct.
Michael Randy's newer book last few years on the death of Caesar. It shows clearly that the reason he was killed is that he was starting to respond to popular will and to bring reforms and changes that would give more power to the Roman citizens and to free some of the ones that were indentured. And he was going against the wishes of the patrician class that he was part of. And then they surrounded and killed him. And I think that's a very good metaphor for the Kennedy assassination.
But it's like it's more covert now. Back then, it was more open. I mean, the same folks that killed Kennedy and King probably thinking in their own mind, even John Wilkes Booth, they thought they were heroes of the people. They thought they were American heroes for doing. They thought they were doing the right thing by getting rid of these people. I mean, even King. I mean, he's the Prince of Peace, whatever. People thought by moving him from the national scene, or even kind of look at the fact that Dr. King. We talk about the Tea Party movement, and people talk about the extremism that's going on in this country. Like Barry Goldwater, to paraphrase him, extremism can be a virtue. And but I look at how Dr. King was being attacked on both left and right. You know, he was being attacked by the New York Times and the Washington Post. They basically signed his death certificate. They say he was useless for the country. He had no business talking about foreign and economic policy. He basically outlived his usefulness. And basically it was these elements that actually helped co-sign his death certificate on both sides of the aisle.
And if you go look in the documents, you'll find one of the documents I gave to Representative Cynthia McKinney, which came out under the JFK Act, even though it was a document relating to Dr. King. There's certain ones in there. This was a FBI document, part of the COINTELPRO, and the theme was that they wanted to not just get King out of the way, but they had someone in mind to replace King in what they called a clean Negro.
Right.
That they could replace Dr. King with. And so, they wanted not just to eliminate him, but to manipulate the leadership that would come in afterwards. And, this is so convoluted that, these people involved elements within the Muslim to help set up for the murder of Malcolm after making Malcolm into an enemy of the of the nation in their terms, in this fight that they started, and a role that seems Dr. Farrakhan played in that, if nothing else, targeting him. But then years later, you have what turns out to be an FBI agent posing as a drug dealer, feeding drugs to Malcolm X's daughter in Chicago, and then living with her, and then suggesting to her that she kill Farrakhan in exchange for the death of her father.
He was a Jewish guy there, right? He was a Jewish white guy?
Yes, but he was working for FBI, and I mean, just think about the implications of that. I mean, turning people against each other, making it appear or getting them involved in one death and then going a generation later. And that's not the only case. Tupac Shakur, I believe, is another one.
Right.
I had to get the no-fly list designation off of Ahmed Maceo Eldridge Cleaver's son. There were other people that came forward, Biggie Smalls and Mother, and there was and continues to be, I believe, an attack on the sons and daughters of the targets of the COINTELPRO of the 60s. It may not have that name now, but that is an ongoing and active program of political harassment and assassination that continues to target even the next generation, in the same way that I'm saying that you have Army intelligence spying on King's grandfather, and then he's under close surveillance by Army intelligence, CIA, and FBI all at the same time at the time of his murder. And we got the documents loose that showed that was under something called Operation Lantern Spike, and that was part of Garden Plot, which was a martial law plan in California under the Reagan administration, and also an Army intelligence run. Operation Golden Bear was the full plan. Garden Plot was the spying on the radical elements, and Lantern Spike was supposed to be anti-riot, but it was Lantern Spike spying on King in Memphis right up to the day of his death, and spying close, like emptying his trash can, knowing where his flights would be, surveilling him, bugging the room, all that was going on, and we got the last document, which was an after-action report as a result of that FOIA suit that we brought, a 36-page after-action report. Well, an after-action report is a summary of raw data, and we said if it was worth preserving that historically, why wouldn't the raw data have been of equal, if not more, historical value? But they claim that it was destroyed. And but we did get that loose, and it shows that they were there. Now, one of the people that ran that Operation Garden Plot and was part of that planning in California in the Reagan administration was brought in to head up the Federal Emergency Management Association, FEMA, which has a long string of bad actors in charge of it, including Colonel Becton, who was the commander of Colin Powell in Red Army 1 in Vietnam, and the two of them had decided to cover up the My Lai massacre in Vietnam of the civilians because they said it would ruin morale at home and among the troops and among the Vietnamese if they let the truth out. And it was a year later that the vets got back and got the word out about My Lai. And Becton held martial law planning operations at FEMA, but preceding him was Louis Giffrida, who at the Army War College had done his thesis, if you can imagine this, on to a detailed level on how it would be possible to round up every African American in the United States in order to put them into detention camps in an emergency.
Well, it's like, what do you call it? Like, I know a lot of my black nationalist brothers and sisters, they talk about the Rex 84 plan. They refer to it as
Rex 84 was one exercise. That actually had to do with the Hispanic community. It was a plan. He'd do a Rex readiness exercise every year. So the one in 84 was when they were in the middle of the Contragate and the Contra wars in Nicaragua, and they had a large Nicaraguan population in the United States, and they had a lot of people supporting, providing sanctuary, and were anti the Contra war here among American radicals and progressives, anti-war forces, and they were spying on all of them too, and they came up with an exercise because they said there might come a point where the people in America would rise up and try to stop the war from happening, and that they would engage the Nicaraguan immigrant community as well, and it would overwhelm them, and so they came up with these plans and carried out a little exercise about rounding up American radicals and Nicaraguan sympathizers to the Sandinistas and putting them in camps. So that's just one of a number of these exercises that had to do with different elements that they, again, were afraid might have political sway in the United States or change public policy. Now, of course, in the post-9/11, it's all legal. In the Patriot Act, anyone who's using what they call violence, which of course is usually started by the police anyway, but can be blamed on the protesters, in order to change public policy, can be referred to as a terrorist. And it's open now that you can assassinate an American citizen legally if you believe that they're part of Al-Qaeda or they're plotting against the United States. They're not going to have a trial to find out whether that's true. It's just you suspect them of that. And if you go back to the language in the 1950s of the original plans for mass detention in the communist hating period, Pat McCarran, one of the most reactionary senators, came up with the McCarran Act, and it didn't die eventually until, I believe, the 90s. It was still on the books. But in the 50s, they came up with this plan to have a nationwide roundup. And they looked at eventually for planning for it, at railroads and airports and stadiums, and they did city planning of the black communities so that they were surrounded in certain ways by the highways and other things to make it easy to lock them off and round them up. But this was to take people into detention camps without writ of habeas corpus or appearance before a judge or jury, and the language was anyone who might possibly be thinking of probably committing any act of espionage or sabotage in the United States.
It was like the Redskins, McCarthy era and stuff like that. And I want to touch on this because, you offering so much information, and a lot of folks that are not initiated to what you're saying need to start listening. I'm just glad this is being archived, but I want to just back it up to Malcolm and Martin And you talking about the clean Negro, the guy that they wanted. I mean, Hoover and them wanted was Samuel Pierce, who was the HUD secretary. I guess.
I think that's one of the people that was.
Yeah.
Yes.
And also, I want to talk about the police and military intelligence, because in both cases with Martin and Malcolm, you had police intelligence infiltrators, especially with Malcolm, Eugene Roberts out of Bosse.
Eugene Roberts out of the Boss unit.
Yeah.
We just had a person testify at and speak at our most recent COPA event on the 45th anniversary of Malcolm's assassination in New York. Roland Shepard, who was a labor organizer and socialist at the time, who knew Malcolm and sold his paper to him that day, he said, and had a regular place he would sit in the Audubon when Malcolm spoke and sell the paper outside. And he came in and sat in his usual seat, and Gene Roberts, who later came out, that was tied with the BOSSI, Bureau of Special Services and Investigations, which was basically a counterintelligence unit within the New York Police Department, and posing as a bodyguard for Malcolm X at the time, came over and told Roland to get out of his usual seat and to move across, and didn't give him any reason. He just told him, get over, don't sit here, go sit over there. So he took a different seat, and then three individuals came in and sat down. One of them in his seat had a large, long, powder blue full-length jacket on, under which he was hiding a shotgun that he later pulled out, and Roland watched from the front row as these guys stood up and effected the assassination of Dr. King and saw them clearly. He was eventually brought down to the police station, not to testify about who had shot Malcolm, but they wanted to know who he knew and whether this person was working with Malcolm, and this was who was a deputy, and they were sweating him a little bit, and he didn't want to be there, and so he told me he had to go to the bathroom. And as he got to the bathroom, the door opened, and the fellow that had wielded the shotgun against Malcolm walked out of the bathroom, down the hall, and he watched him go in to the offices and go sit at a desk.
Wow.
New York Police Department. There's other witnesses, the guy that founded one of the radical, I'm sorry, I'm forgetting the name, but it's something Africa, but it's like one of the revolutionary African groups.
African Liberation Army or something.
It's Howard Ferguson, I think is the guy's name.
Okay.
I'm sorry, this is like 20 years now. But he spoke to me and told me that he had been a witness to a guy coming out. They arrested one of the gunmen. The crowd grabbed him. And he just recently got out of jail. And was released. But that was the only one that was actually shooting it at the trial. He said the other two that they had picked up and charged with it were not. They got out of jail sooner than he did. By about 20 years, but he contended that they were not the other gunmen. And so they had fake gunmen to cover all but the one that they couldn't, get off from. And these guys were connected to a mosque in New Jersey. Baba Zak Kondo has an excellent book called Conspiracies Unraveling the Assassination of Malcolm X, where he actually tracked down the names and the identities of the real assassins of Malcolm and how the FBI played its role in setting the situation up. But there were other bodyguards that it turned out eventually, worked for either within the Nation of Islam or police FBI or both, and that Malcolm was not well guarded. In my experience from the 60s forward, the person who volunteers to do security is the one you need to get out the door.
That sounds right. Cause, I mean, with Roberts, my understanding, I read some of my brother Roland Shepard stuff online, and he was talking about, how Roberts, he had a fondness, he said, Roberts said he had a fondness for Malcolm. Kind of like William O'Neill had this emulation from Chairman Fred Hampton, even though he helped, kill.
Sometimes the way they get people to infiltrate an organization and do that dirty work is they tell them that, the organization is good and well-meaning, but that there are more radical elements that are trying to get into it and destroy it, and that's what they're really looking for, and they don't want them, they don't say it's because they dislike the organization or even the leadership, they couch it in terms that there's some more evil element trying to destroy it, and they need them to help prevent that. But that's the excuse they give them, or in their head, or they may have in their mind a personal relationship to somebody. But I don't care how fond of you are of me. I'd rather you didn't tell the FBI everything I'm doing.
Right. Oh, of course. Yeah, I understand that. But I was just like, Malcolm was very well aware what the nation was capable of and what they weren't capable of. Like he said, he trained them. And I think it's interesting that he requested police presence, because normally at a Malcolm X or a Colonel Rolling Shelter, there'll be at least 30 or 50 police officers.
Absolutely.
At a Malcolm X rally, nobody was
that
there.
Day, in the same way that Maximilian Reich, the head of Army intelligence at a nearby base from Dallas, who normally would have come in and assisted the Secret Service, was called that day on the 22nd of November and told to stand down. King's normal contingent of police were pulled off from him. The invaders were told to leave the area, supposedly on King's request, which was not true. And and people that normally would have been closer to him or could have guarded him were taken off. The guy that normally worked on his behalf in Memphis was physically accosted and thrown into a trunk of a car, driven away from the scene. So that's common, that you compromise the security. The Secret Service doesn't follow its rules or its procedures. Just as recently, I noticed that this supposed gate crashing at the White House, they don't vet you at the door of the White House when you're coming to the event. They vet you months in advance, and they know exactly who you are, and you have to provide all sorts of information, intelligence, and pictures, and they know who's supposed to come in and out that door. If I try to get in that door without any reason, I don't get in. I get sent to St. Elizabeth's, the federal psychiatric prison. I'm not kidding. There's 120 cases a year called White House cases where they lock people up there and they grill them, and they say that they're crazy because they think the president wants to help them.
Right.
That means they're delusional.
Yeah,
if you try too hard to get in the White House and you don't belong there, you're going to end up at St. E's. And so you can't just walk in there. Mm-hmm. So when you have a guy like on the day of Reagan's inauguration and on the day of Obama's inauguration up in their personal quarters, somebody let them in.
Right.
Those are messages to the president that they are not secure, that they can put security around themselves, but they can have a guy when they go reach for their jammies. And you don't have to have a gun to kill somebody. You can stand next to somebody and kill them.
Like, also Eugene Roberts, I want to let people know, because you mentioned Tupac possibly being killed by the government, that Eugene Roberts was the same person that set up Tupac's mom and the Panther 21. And he was the same guy that set them up.
These guys move in and out of different scenarios.
And characters different. Yeah, they all can. It's a web. But even with Memphis, you talk about Memphis. You talk about the Memphis invaders. I had a chance to talk to Dr. Kobe Smith. He was like the first black person to graduate from Rose College here in Memphis.
Yeah.
He talked about things, Murd. He's one of the co-founders of the Memphis Invaders. And he talked about this cat named Morrell McCullough, who was an undercover intelligence officer, right? He was working for the MPD. He was posing as a Memphis invader. And he was in that famous shot, that famous photograph of Dr. King, right?
Yes.
Holding Dr. King.
He runs up onto the balcony and holds King's head, and he had posed as an invader on behalf of the Memphis Police Intelligence Unit. Within that unit, he was also posing as that when he was actually working for the Office of Naval Intelligence. He got a job later at the CIA. And I think that he was sent there as an ear to see what King's associates were saying or doing right after the shooting. But you talk about a lack of a criminal investigation in a crime scene. I don't know if you saw the 50 years after King's assassination, or 40 years after this year, when Life magazine put out a series of photos that have been buried in their files for years of the aftermath of the shooting, and there's one of the rooming house, and there's ones of his associates in the room up on the second floor, and he didn't really belong up in that room. That room was switched at the last minute to put him up there, because if he had come out a lower door, the car would have been in front of it. There wouldn't have been room or time to shoot him. There would have been people in the way. So you put him up on the second floor, he's got to walk the length of the balcony and give you a clear shot, even if he's moving, so you can get down. And Reverend Billy Kyles, when I was at the 30th anniversary, was standing up on a stage, and they were having a thing about King's life, and he was up there with Jesse Jackson, who claimed to have held King in his arms, but actually this Naval Intelligence and Memphis police guy did, McCullough. But here's Reverend Kyles put his two indexes, pointing fingers, next to each other. And he's standing up there on the stage, and he says, and I've asked myself over the years, why was I there with Dr. King when he was killed? And why did God put me there? Now, he's the one that got King out on the balcony. He came and said his wife didn't like her food to get cold and he should get moving.
Right.
And so he drew King out of the room, and he was with the SCLC there. Then he, he wasn't right next to King when he was shot. And he tells the story. He says, I was standing next to Dr. King like this, and he puts his two index fingers up. He said, and I moved, and I am quoting him. I've got the video.
Right.
I moved down to the right so they could get a clear shot. And I asked myself later, why was I sent to be with Dr. King? And God told me that I was there so he could die a clean death, not stabbed to death in an alley or overdosed by drugs.
This is Reverend Billy Kyles. He did a 40-inch slip.
That's right. Now you tell me what that man is saying.
He's saying basically he's the Judas.
He's setting him up for a clean death so that he doesn't have a dirty one. That's the excuse they gave him.
So they're trying to say instead of him, being caught in an undesirable position because of the rumors of him having a sex or, you heard about the rumors.
Preserve his
orgy in the room. You know what?
I don't know whether any of that stuff is true. I think he was also staying down. King was staying at a different room in there, and it was still up on that level. But he wasn't always in that room, and it's quite possible if they got a bug out of that room, it was of somebody else having sex. But they did try to use it and send it to Coretta, and threatened. At first, they threatened to reveal it. He'd better kill himself. They were using it that way. He also was going to stay at the other hotel in Memphis, which was a white-owned hotel where he had stayed before, and the FBI was behind a letter telling him, why, pretending to be a black man, saying, why are you staying at this white hotel? Why aren't you down at the Lorraine? The woman who ran the hotel, Lorraine, was her name, Bailey was the last name. The hotel was named after her. She was approached by somebody still not yet identified, a black man, although some testimony letter they said that they thought it might have been a white man posing as a black man, like in blackface or something, but something strange about it, who came and asked her on behalf of King to change the room and move the room up to the second floor. And when she heard what happened to King and realized that she was possibly part of helping to set him up inadvertently and unwittingly, she went in her room and cried and had a heart attack and died that day. But in these photos that came out, here there's also a picture of her husband, Mr. Bailey, up on the balcony. This reporter said he ran right over there, so this is probably within an hour of King dying, and King shot right after 6, and it's getting dark. And so it's dark in the picture, and you have the photo flash, and he's up there with a bucket and a scrub brush, and he's cleaning the blood up.
Yeah, I seen that, yeah.
Well, where's the police tape? That's not a crime scene. It's just like, it's such an amazing, just that picture should tell you volumes about, what it meant to them to kill Dr. King and how little they cared whether justice would ever be done.
Yeah, I think it was very interesting because I know people talk about, the O.J. trial, the trial of the century, the first O.J. trial. And folks talking about the reason, even if he did do it or didn't do it, the LAPD screwed up. They didn't follow, basic police work when it came to forensics, and they violated the crime scene. And I've seen in every major American conspiracy, the crime scene has always been violated. Like you talk about Dr. King, even with Malcolm X, even with JFK, his body supposed to stayed in Dallas to do an autopsy on. They actually let the federal government come in to tell the local officials how to run their law enforcement.
Well, they just pulled out their automatic weapons and grabbed the body and took it.
I mean, that's crazy, though. How can the rules be suspended for these major historical turning points in our nation's history.
Yeah.
And yet for OJ, Heisman winner, football star, whatever, the juice, we got to call foul. But when it comes to Dr. King, I mean, his civil trial in '99 didn't get any type of media attention in this country.
Nothing.
No entertainment, nobody covered that. It was very important because James Earl Ray, I also want to mention this point. Because James Earl Ray, his first lawyer was Percy Foreman, who was a mob lawyer.
That's
with
right.
connections in
All
Dalton,
ties
Houston.
with CIA.
And Woody Harrelson, father lawyer. Woody Harrelson's father has been accused of being the gunman or aggression or whatever, being at the JFK assassination.
Claimed to have been, yeah. Uh-huh.
He was one of the tramps, they said, but he was a mob enforcer, hitman.
Yes.
And Percy Foreman was the guy that was James Earl Ray's first lawyer.
Yes.
I mean, how can people, these slimy people keep on reappearing and wreaking all types of havoc on us?
What I find is that these lawyers and these coroners, they just cross over. The psychiatrists that you see afterwards that evaluate you, they're used over and over and over again. And I call it, if it ain't broke, you don't fix it.
Wow. I want to also talk about this character. I want to move in. You just got so much information. I want to move this into Jonestown because this all ties into the MLK, even JFK assassinations. And Jim.
Let me make one more point about political assassinations and why I study them. If you go back and study the history of the rise of fascism in Germany, you'll see that from 1928 till 1932, there were a series of 400 unsolved political murders of labor leaders, of musicians, of organizers, of people that spoke out, of even of academics that were teaching progressive politics. And the Weimar Republic police said they couldn't solve any of them, but they knew that they were politically motivated.
Wow.
And these are being carried out by a group called the Freikorps, which was disaffected veterans that eventually became the Brown Shirts and formed the basis for Hitler's rise to power. But part of that rise was dependent on knocking out the hundreds of voices that would have stood against him effectively in the period before he rose. And I believe that we're living in that same period now. We've had years of political assassinations in this country. We have a rise of proto-fascist law and dual legal systems and unconstitutional stuff after 9/11. We're being prepped for some kind of a crisis. It can now, doesn't have to be a nuclear bomb now. It can be a plague. It can be a breakout of some disease. It can be a natural disaster or an attack of some kind. But when that happens, to be taken into this continuity of government plan, which means that a very small percentage of the executive branch, and not the Congress, they're expendable. And the heads of these intelligence agencies take over and make all the decisions. And the continuity of government was declared on November 11th, 2001, in D.C. openly. A month later, the Washington Post said secret government operating or shadow government operating in secret, big headline on the Post. About Cheney and these other officials down in bunkers in an undisclosed location making the decisions. And it was a combination of the Pentagon, FEMA, and the National Security Council who were in charge at that point. And these plans have existed. There was Office of Emergency Preparedness and other things. But once they come up with the excuse that they need to go to Code Red, and to say that we're in a complete emergency. We've been in an emergency since Truman and the Korean War.
Right.
Never let up on, but executive orders sign it off, and Bush has signed off on it every year since 9/11, and now Obama continues to sign off on it. And when you're in that emergency mode, a lot of legal niceties and constitutional rights suddenly change. And power aggrandizes to the executive. And all of the violations that Bush was doing that should have led to, that would have been grounds for impeachment, and you can see them listed, over 100 of them that I researched on groundsforimpeachment.com, all of those things that he was violating and should have been impeached if not imprisoned for, along with his vice president and most of his cabinet officials, are still going on and have not changed under the current Obama administration, because the presidents come and go, but this system of control sits and grows. And it doesn't have the American people or certainly the interests of people of color or people abroad in mind. We're all expendable to them in the same way that the German population, certain segments of it along racial and other lines, were considered expendable then. And we're useless eaters taking up space. And we're essentially in the same position now as the German people were in September of 1939. And the world's future rests on us, and we really have to take the responsibility for that. It was up to the Germans to stop Hitler, and it's up to us to change this into a real democracy here so that there can be democracy and freedom around the world without this huge military and spy machinery going into every country in the world, doing political assassinations and overthrows and manipulation, just so that American corporations, global corporations, can put a squeeze on the cheap labor and the access to the resources that could be keeping us and the rest of the world alive.
I mean, it's a point you made. It's like you should be. Oliver Stone should make a movie about you. And like, I'm serious. Like you like an unsung hero. I really admire you. The more I
appreciate that. I've been speaking out over the years. It's very hard for me to get any forum. I'm generally negatively seen by the official left in this country, and I'm called a conspiracy theorist, which I find laughable. I often say you can call me a conspiracy theorist if you call everyone else a coincidence theorist, but I'm unearthing the hidden history of this country on the basis of documentation and hard research. And I want to establish here in D.C. a museum of hidden history that would tell the real story of the assassinations and the covert operations of the last 50 years, the history we can't see because of our assumptions or we don't see because of our paradigms and our racism and our sexism that hides history and counter-narratives, and also the history that we're not allowed to see by the national security state. And young people who come here by the millions, 20 million tourists a year, need to have a museum in D.C. that tells them the truth.
I definitely agree with that. And also, I want to touch back on Reverend Billy Cow. It's like he adds or he embellishes to his story. I know he did the Eyewitness, the HBO documentary, but I just want to add a point I think is interesting. I've seen a documentary that was done a while back. It has you in it, of course, because it wouldn't be legitimate if it didn't have you in it. And I'm serious, but he talked about how all the local news stations actually broadcast what Dr. King was staying in his room. It's like, to me, it's like broadcasting the head of state. Yeah, he stayed at the Peabody, but you telling people that on the exact floor, the room number. I mean, that's insane to me. That you look at how
it's a way of setting up the cover story, because then you can say that Ray heard it, just in the same way that they printed a route of the motorcade of Kennedy the day before in the Dallas Morning News or that morning, and Oswald's supposed to have looked at it and seen it went by the book depository and gotten ready to kill him, but and then when the Warren Commission prints it, they black it out because it doesn't show it going. It shows it going straight out Main Street and going over the ramp on the other side of the overpass and getting onto Stemmons. It doesn't show that double turn onto Elm and putting it right at the base of the book depository. But if Oswald had been on the 6th floor, which he wasn't, and if he had a rifle, which he didn't, and if he had shot a shot at Kennedy, which he did not, it would have made more sense to shoot him coming toward Elm Street than after he'd turned and started down it and the trees were in the way and he was getting further away by the minute. From that window, he had a straight-on shot at Kennedy, right straight down Houston Street, but, supposedly didn't take it. But if you believe the official story, he had half a magazine anyway and only 3 bullets in the gun when it could have held 6. Now, that's a sport. You're going to go kill the president, you don't take half the ammunition.
Right, but the thing about it is, too, who approved of that silly route? You think about it now. I mean, you got these tall buildings.
Yeah, that route was illegal under Secret Service procedure. That turn was illegal. It slowed it down too much. The original route would have been consistent. They dragged off the Secret Service guys that normally stood at the back. And then you can see them in the footage at Love Field throwing their hands in the air like, why are you telling me not to do my job? They pulled him off so that Kennedy's head was more visible from the rear and in the front, and got them out of the way. And they fought, the guy hit the brake. The driver hit the brake when he heard the shot instead of speeding up, which they're trained to do. All these different procedures were violated, and that route was changed at John Connolly's Oil Club the day before. Forrest Sorrells, the FBI guy, was there, a Secret Service guy who was green named Wong, and the advance crew that Bill Moyers had actually set up for Kennedy out of Jack Peterbaugh's agency. Elizabeth Forsing Harris and Jack Peterbaugh were there. She suggested taking the roof off the bubble top off the car, the weather bubble, which might have deflected a shot or slowed someone down from shooting him, and all of the decisions made there made Kennedy far more vulnerable. When Oswald was working at the he was at Jagger Charles Stovall, and most people don't know Oswald's background, but if you study the Patsy, it will solve the case for you. And I was at Dulles Airport some years ago, and they had a display of what you can see from a satellite, completely phony. It showed these grainy photographs of buildings and things where you couldn't see any detail. You can see a golf ball and read a license plate and see an expression on someone's face from a satellite. The Hubble satellites were designed to look back here. That's why when they turned them to outer space, they had to go up and adjust the lens. Facing the other way, they can see back to the light that begins the universe. So you don't think they can see you down here, a mile away?
Right.
Okay, and so it's, but they had this phony exhibit at Dulles, which is named after the head of the CIA, out here, and they had this exhibit where you can see, and then they had the spy planes, including the SR-71, and they had stuff about the U-2, and they had a mock-up plane of the U-2, and then they had a case saying that the U-2s flew over Cuba during the Cuban Missile Crisis, and they got photos of the Quonset huts and the trucks with the braces to hold the nuclear weapons and anti-ballistic missiles, or ballistic missiles with the nuclear warheads on them that were sent into Cuba to defend themselves, and were the basis of the Cuban Missile Crisis and almost going to nuclear war. Well, these photos had been analyzed and then sent to the National Reconnaissance Organization, and so they have an actual glossy photograph in the case from their collection of this photo to prove how they could see that these things had carried nuclear weapons in there. And typed at the bottom of this old photo in typewriter font from back then in the 60s, it says, "Courtesy of Jagger Charles Stovall." Well, I mean, I was standing there and just started laughing my head off. 99% or plus of the American public wouldn't know what that meant.
Right.
The primary photographic analyst at Jagger Charles Stovall at the time that picture was taken was none other than Lee Harvey Oswald. And Oswald they didn't have equipment there to do the kind of microdot shrinking or enlargement work that he needed to do, and they had better equipment at an ad agency, and so they went out and subcontracted the ad agency, and Oswald went over there about 60 times looking at different aerial photographs and analyzing them to then be sent back to the intelligences from this subcontractor, Jagger Charles, which you couldn't work at if you didn't have a high clearance anyway, and he was naval intelligence himself, Oswald, and crypto clearance, very high, and it actually tracked the U-2 and was stationed everywhere that it operated out of and tracked it on the radar even before anyone knew what it was. He called it the boxcar, and it went at high speeds and up at high altitudes where everybody else laughed at him when he tracked it and called the coordinates out because they said nothing could fly that high or that fast, but he was tracking the U-2 itself. And in fact, when he went to the Soviet Union on this fake defection, he told the embassy he was going to give the secrets of the U-2 up to the Russians, which again was part of a cover story so that they could blow the U-2 out of the sky in the middle of Khrushchev visiting in the beginning of détente with Eisenhower, and sabotage the détente and say that Oswald had told them how to do it. But in fact, the pilot knew, Gary Powers, that the plane had been sabotaged and that the Americans had blown up something because there was nothing the Russians had to track it or hit it with at that altitude and that speed, and that they had sabotaged it to go down. He didn't take his poison pill, which he was supposed to, and eventually had to be changed over with another spy, but That was all part of Oswald's cover story and his defection to the Soviet Union, and then he comes back and he's taken the Cuban Missile pictures that lead to the crisis at Jagerchow's Stovall. Well, the ad agency that he went to 60 times was Jack Peterbaugh's agency.
Mm-hmm.
The guy that sits in there later on Bill Moyer's behalf doing the advance work and public relations work for the president. And they make this decision to change the motorcade route 48 hours before it happens. And then that morning, LBJ has a huge argument with Kennedy because he was supposed to be sitting with Connally in order to get the vote. I'm sorry, he's supposed to be sitting with Yarborough in order to get the vote, and Yarborough was no friend of LBJ's, and LBJ wanted his pal Connally back in the car with him. But when they switched it, and Connally was going to sit up with Kennedy, LBJ threw a hissy fit that morning. And LBJ knew it was coming. He's the only one that ducks when the bullets ring out, and so they plan these things top to bottom, and they plan them well, and they know what they're doing. And we sit back and watch, and we don't get it. They had plenty of reason to kill John F. Kennedy. I know from my own family history that he was pulling out of Vietnam. My mother projected the draft call for 30 years for the Joint Chiefs of Staff. She was 5 levels above top security and had access to the war room. And she became disaffected with the Vietnam War. And later, after she retired, told me that Kennedy had given orders to change her projections, which had to be right 5 years in advance. For the first time in her career, in April of '63, she put in projections for a full withdrawal of all American troops out of Vietnam by the end of the following year, following when Kennedy would be back in office. And I asked her when did they reverse that, and she said it was the Monday following the assassination. And they told her then to project the exact opposite, a 10-year war in Vietnam, in which 57,000 Americans would die. And this is November 25, 1963, with Kennedy barely in the grave. They're giving her the accurate cost and death projections of the war that would eventually stop at the edge of going into Laos and Cambodia and a whole sector war that they wanted to carry on with. That was the one that my generation stopped, was the wider war, but they projected and finished their war in Vietnam, which was a war of genocide and ecological destruction.
That's crazy. Also, I want to tell something. We got to talk about Jonestown, because you got a lot of information on Jonestown and how all this relates to MLK and JFK and even Malcolm. But I'm fascinated by the use of doubles. Like, we talk about the phenomenon between Lee Oswald and Harvey Oswald.
Yeah.
It's been made, and it's been proven in a lot of ways that
there were at least 2 Oswalds.
Right.
Strangely enough, I believe that I actually met the real Oswald, the one that Marguerite raised up in New Orleans, and who became the Marine and defected. But he is not the Oswald, I believe, that Marina met and married and came back with.
Mm-hmm.
And when I raised this with General Fabian Escalante in a meeting in the Bahamas between Cuban intelligence heads and some of the JFK researchers, so that we could go over the Mexico City operation where Oswald was doubled by somebody who didn't even look like him, in order to get his name linked to Castro weeks before the assassination, which was part of something I believe called Operation Northwoods. This is a plan that came to light under the JFK Records Act that we got passed, and it's written about in James Bamford's book, The Body of Secrets. And the Joint Chiefs, LeMay and the others, and Lyman Lemnitzer, all signed off on it. And it was a series of plans that would create a traumatic incident, real or not, that would shock the American people and anger them, that could plausibly be blamed on Castro, and then to use the incident in order to invade Cuba and kill him. And they had things like blowing up a ship off Guantanamo Bay and blaming it on Castro, having a fake commercial airliner shot down by the Cubans off the shores of Cuba, with fake obituaries to go home to the people in the town, and a drone to go through and light up their defenses so that they would shoot it down and believe they shot something down, in the same way that I think years later they similarly faked the Russians into the Audat 7 thing and blew the plane up themselves in order to sabotage a move to get rid of the big defense budget and go to a peace budget so that they could have the evil empire claims and stuff. But this was, this was to fake a commercial airliner being shot down by them and blamed on him. Riots in Cuba that would be done by the anti-Castro Cubans and kill people, but be blamed on Castro's supporters, and even a plan to blow John Glenn up on the way to the moon, and then to blame it on Castro, so that they would have the excuse and the public support to go in and take him out. Kennedy balked at this plan. He refused to be a part of it. He told them to cancel it. And I believe that their response to that was to make the Kennedy assassination itself into the traumatic incident that they would use to get Castro. And Castro himself says that he realizes, and this is 3 days after the assassination, that he's being set up to take the blame. He knows about the phony Oswald asking to get into Cuba through the Cuban consulate and the embassies down there, going to the Soviets, and he realizes that he's being suckered, and that, of course, in truth, the last thing he wanted was to put LBJ in when Kennedy, by back channel, was trying to normalize relations with Cuba, and Kennedy had stepped in and stopped the assassination plans when he found out about them against Castro, and had also stopped the raids. So Kennedy was going a completely different direction, and one that Castro had no reason to oppose. And all this garbage about Robert Kennedy couldn't say who killed his brother because he'd been part of plots to kill Castro, I think is just garbage. I don't think even the plots that we know about, most of them, the CIA Mafia plots, had anything to do with killing Castro, because in my view, if you can kill John F. Kennedy and take over this country in a military coup, you can sure as hell kill Castro.
Right. Basically.
And so, what are you talking about? That he can protect himself and Kennedy can't? I mean, they could kill him if they wanted him dead, but he was better as a whipping boy and a phony threat, 90 miles offshore, communism, blah, blah, blah. There were CIA people who funded him and armed him for the revolution against Batista. There were other elements that wanted Prios and the mob to go back in and get their casinos, but and in fact, guns were run to Castro under that CIA money by a guy named McWillie and also Jack Ruby, and so they had supported him at first. Then there were these plots apart of him to kill him. But I think the Mafia CIA assassination plotting around Castro was a smoke and mirror cover for them developing a domestic assassination capability that they could use later in the other assassinations.
Yeah, I would agree, because I think even with Dr. King, you talk about Frank Liberto, a produce dealer in Memphis who got connections to the Marcello mob.
Yes.
In New Orleans, who also was complicit in the Bay of Pigs, and then, Marcello was not a friend of the Kennedy brothers. They, like, nemesis.
They had deported him, and Robert Kennedy was going after the mob.
Mm-hmm.
And Robert Kennedy was going to be sent in to head up Operation Mongoose and take it away from General Lansdale, who was also seen at Dealey Plaza in the photos, walking the other direction from the tramps, and was way high up in Air Force intelligence. And LeMay was Air Force intelligence as well, the general in charge of the Air Force at the Joint Chiefs level, and one of the main enemies of the Kennedys, and the main plotter, in my view, of the coup against him. And Jack Kennedy was going to have Bobby go in and clean out the whole CIA, put him in as director of the CIA, but he had already inserted him into Mongoose to stop the assassination plotting, not to carry it out, but to stop it. And so now we get these phony books out saying that Robert Kennedy and John Kennedy were trying to kill Castro, and it backfired on them, and that's why he was killed. But this is, again, just one more lie about the real reason that Kennedy was killed. He was pushing racial integration too fast for the Southern Rim whites, too slow for the black community, but you can't evaluate him from the progressive position. You have to evaluate him from the reactionary position and what the right thought of him, because that's who killed him. So I don't mean to paint him as a saint, but he was responding to Dr. King and the civil rights, and he was making differences, and he was he was setting the stage for what eventually became the civil rights legislation that LBJ carried out, and he was going to scatter the CIA to the four winds. He said he was threatening the oil tax depletion allowance, which was $13 billion in tax write-off for oil, and financed elections in those years. Nixon, who was supposed to beat him in the election, had been put up by those oil and Southern interests going all the way back to the 40s, when a committee of 100 with Prescott Bush, the grandfather of the last President Bush, and himself, skull and bones, as his son.
Nazi help. He helped.
And ties with the Nazis, and they had this committee of 100 people who would put up $100,000 each in order to prep someone to be president of the United States. And Nixon answered their ad in the California papers in the 40s, and was primed to take the election. And in fact, if it hadn't been for old man Kennedy's ties with the mob and the corruption of the voting in West Virginia and especially in Cook County in Illinois and Chicago by the Dealey circle, Kennedy wouldn't have won the election. Nixon won the popular vote, and Kennedy manipulated through his father, they manipulated the vote for the Electoral College and got him in.
And also, I would say, too, in the tradition of Jackson, Andrew Jackson, and FDR, in a lot of ways, even more progressive, he took on the Federal Reserve. He tried to get the government less dependent on the Federal Reserve, try to give it, the money some backing, civil backing, right? Silver certificates.
He did issue some, it wasn't the first president to do it, and it wasn't a huge run, but he did issue some direct, I think they were silver certificates that weren't certificates from the Fed, but he wasn't going to close the Fed down or something. I mean, and the Federal Reserve, I think, represents the Eastern establishment far more than the Southern Rim economy that rose up after World War II and was the basis of the military-industrial complex that was rising and coming against the old Eastern establishment. But he had enemies on both sides. He had made a lot of people mad, Big Steel, and firing somebody at the level of Allen Dulles, and he was moving to chase the Galen Network and the Nazis out of the CIA, who had ties into Dallas and ties directly to Harry Oswald and his circle through the White Russians, and part of setting Oswald up. So these historical connections go back, but I think, and people don't understand why Kennedy was killed, or the left sticks their nose up and says he was false hope. But false or not, you go into poor homes, black homes in the South now, you will see on the mantle Jesus Christ, Dr. King, and the Kennedy brothers.
Well, that's true. And, I had to say this, too. He was given a clean death, like one of our friends was. He gave him a clean death, you know what I'm saying? We gave him a modest death. And I also want to say this, people, we talked about Malcolm earlier. We talked about the fact that his chief bodyguard was a bossy agent through the NYPD. And also people don't understand, too, like we talk about his daughter being tricked by the government to assassinate Farrakhan. It really wasn't Farrakhan. It was the press secretary of the Nation of Islam, which was discovered by Louis Lomax in the 60s before they killed him. There was John
Lomax is hardly known, but Lomax
we need to know
followed the route of Dr. King and did excellent research, and then killed himself.
Right. Like, he died. He figured out it was John Ali. It was the Judas. John Ali, the press secretary for the Nation of Islam. Yeah. He was an FBI informant that set up Malcolm and Elijah Muhammad split. Who shared some leaks to the press about, Elijah Muhammad having, infidelity issues.
Mm-hmm.
I think people didn't know that. I think people didn't know about Louis Lomax. I think we don't appreciate you, because you're an investigative journalist.
Louis Lomax started out, as a guy that went around a musicologist and collecting the blues singers' tapes, and that's how he knew a lot of those poor communities in the South. But when he got on to the assassinations, he had the roots, and he followed the paths, and he went and interviewed the people and made sense of things. A lot of the early people that did the work on these cases are unknown.
Right. And
in fact, most people don't know that the main researchers in the early part of the Kennedy assassination were women. They're my mentor, Mae Brussel, Sylvia Marr in New York, who wrote a great book, Accessories After the Fact, Lillian Castellano, who started doing the clippings, and These people work together, Maggie Fields, and they're almost unknown. Most people haven't heard of Penn Jones, who followed all the witness deaths and was a field-appointed brigadier general in World War II. But he was also friends with the photographer who did the book Black Like Me, and he was he was close with Thomas Merton. And Merton said in 1936, when nobody else got it, if America fights Hitler, it will become Hitler.